to Refuge, Asylum, Detention, a Feminist and Queer Lens. My name is Jane Jeffer, and I'm a professor and director of Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Cornell. It's my pleasure to moderate today's event, which is part actually of our year-long celebration of our 50th anniversary of FGSS and our 30th anniversary of LGBT studies. In a moment, I'll introduce our three speakers, all of whom are affiliated with the program. As we say in the description of today's event, 84 million people and counting worldwide have been forcibly displaced by war and violence. And while much scholarly and activist attention has been paid to this issue, relatively little work addresses refuge, asylum, and detention through a feminist and queer lens. What that means, and what you'll hear more about today, is that gender and sexuality are critical to understanding these issues, and also that feminist and queer theories are illuminating as approaches and methodologies. We also must go beyond analysis to engagement and activism. And we've done that as a program through our work in the last 3 years, partly in collaboration with the Justice for Migrant Families group in Buffalo. We'll put up a link connecting to their work to the student group that Pramila will talk about that's grown out of this collaboration. So just briefly, 3 years ago, FGSS got an Engaged Cornell grant, and it allowed us to do various projects. And the one that's relevant to this program is a collaboration with Justice for Migrant Families, whose primary work involves visiting and advocating for people being incarcerated at the Buffalo Federal Detention Center in Batavia, which is just 2.5 hours down the road from Ithaca. Since then, we've continued this project as part of a larger effort to abolish immigration detention in the US. This work represents what we in FGSS believe to be feminist praxis, the collaboration across sites among local activists, people being detained, faculty, and students, to not only analyze, but also to organize for social justice. Our speakers today, I'm going to say a little bit about each one, and then they'll be talking a little bit about their work, and then we'll go into a series of questions back and forth between them, and then the last half hour we'll leave for your questions. So we have Pramila Kotapalli, who's a junior majoring in FGSS and the College Scholar Program, where her project focuses on mental health and bodily autonomy within the U.S. immigrant detention system. She spearheads the Cornell Anti-Detention Alliance. She's led advocacy and research initiatives for freedom for immigrants, justice for migrant families, and Immigrant Justice Corps. Her research and community work have been shaped by her learning inside the classroom as an FGSS student, and her experiences outside the classroom as the daughter of immigrants. Second, Elif Sari is the Martha L.A. McCain Postdoctoral Fellow at the Marcus Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD in anthropology last year here at Cornell with a graduate minor in FGSS. Drawing on her field research and community collaborations with Iranian LGBTQ refugees in Turkey awaiting resettlement to the US and Canada, Elif is currently working on her book manuscript, which offers an engaged ethnography of transnational queer and trans asylum and explores the relationship between migration, gender sexuality, and waiting. Finally, Professor Saida Hajjuk is an associate professor of anthropology and FGSS here at Cornell. She's the author of The Twilight of Cutting, African Activism and Life After NGOs. She now is focusing on questions of asylum and refuge in transnational perspective. She's currently writing a book of essays called Songs of War, Songs of Refuge, and an ethnography titled Affective Encounters, Humanitarian Afterlives of War and Violence, that critically juxtaposes trends in human rights activism at Amnesty International and the aftermath of humanitarianism in post-war Bosnia. With support from Cornell's Migration Initiative, she's working on a community engagement project called, quote, Refugees Know Things, a podcast and an installation, and a collaborative project called Barely Tolerated, an ethnographic film about life in uncertain refuge and deferred deportation. So with that said, I would just like to briefly thank Cornell for powering this event, and also the Cornell Migrations Initiative for co-sponsoring it. I'd also like to have Nick post our land acknowledgement in the chat for people to read. And so with that, I would like to invite each speaker to briefly describe their really interesting current work on migration. Yeah, so Pramila, would you like to start?
Thank you for that introduction, Professor Jeffer. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel today because the FGSS program at Cornell has really shaped so much of my work and involvements on campus and off. For me, this journey began in fall of 2019 when FGSS, as Professor Jeffer mentioned, hosted a training with advocates from Justice for Migrant Families, a Western New York-based nonprofit that provides direct support to individuals in the Buffalo Federal Immigration Detention Facility. This facility, located in the sparsely populated suburb of Batavia, New York, is New York's largest immigrant detention center, notorious to organizers and advocates, but largely hidden from the eyes of the mass public, despite, as Professor Jeffer mentioned, being a less than 2-hour drive away from Cornell's campus. Once a month on Saturday mornings, the FGSS group would pile into a van and make the trip upstate to the facility, where we met with detained individuals, many of whom we are still in contact with. Some of whom have been released while others have been deported before even having a chance to tell their stories to an immigration judge. After in-person visitation shut down in March of 2020 at the facility, we turned towards other forms of engagement, working on the Justice for Migrant Families Detention Hotline, which was at a particular critical point of need in that summer of the pandemic, and forming virtual visitation groups that following fall to support specific people at the facility. After media and advocacy campaign that we led through Professor Jeffer's fall 2020 class on time and space in immigrant detention, we renamed our group the Cornell Anti-Detention Alliance, or CADA, and centered our work on advocating for an end to immigrant detention in New York. Many of the egregious conditions in detention, which I will discuss today, have been exacerbated through the COVID-19 pandemic, intensifying the need for releases and for abolition. CADA has worked directly with several detained and previously detained individuals and has organized multiple release and accountability campaigns, collaborating with regional and statewide organizers of the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey Coalition and the Dignity Not Detention campaign, which aims to end ICE contracts with immigrant jails in New York. Currently, we are working with our organizational partner, Justice for Migrant Families, on a collaborative awareness and advocacy initiative surrounding detention transfers in ICE era. My research combines this community engagement with an analysis of the structural logics that make up the U.S. detention system, focusing on how the criminalization and containment of migration impacts individual bodily autonomy and community health and safety.
Yes, Alif. Thank you, Pramila. Alif?
Thank you, Pramila. This is really impressive. Thanks for sharing it with us. Thanks, James, for the introduction. And of course, thanks everyone so much for being with us. So today I'm joining you from Toronto. And before I came to Canada as a new immigrant settler, I was a PhD student at Cornell. And for my dissertation, I conducted ethnographic research in Turkey for about 3 years between 2014 and 2020. And I worked with refugees from Iran who went to Turkey to apply for international asylum protection based on their LGBTQ identities. And I guess I could also call them Iranian LGBTQ refugees, but I didn't want to use these national and sexual categories because although they are all from Iran, there are Azeris, Kurds, Afghans, and Arabs within the community. And the term LGBTQ refers to the official identity categories that refugees claim and use in navigating the asylum system. But there are also a lot of other identities and identifications. So I just want to emphasize that I'm talking about a very linguistically, ethnically, religiously, class-wise, and gender and sexuality-wise, a very heterogeneous community. So, as we all know, Turkey in international media and politics is portrayed as a country that hosts the world's largest refugee population because currently there are close to 6 million displaced people in Turkey. But in reality, and what most people don't know about Turkey is that it doesn't give long-term settlement or permanent legal status to refugees. Rather, in this transnational asylum system, it works as a transit country. So refugees go to Turkey, apply for asylum, and they follow their asylum claims through the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR's Turkey branch. And they wait in Turkey until the UNHCR resettles them to a third country. But in this contemporary context, especially with the ongoing border closures, as well as the rising Islamophobia and anti-refugee hatred across the world, waiting times for Middle Eastern refugees and immigrants in general have become much longer. The prospect for their resettlement has become much lower, and this entire process has become much more uncertain. For instance, the vast majority of my interlocutors, even those refugees who applied for asylum and completed all necessary legal procedures as early as 2014, are still in Turkey. Actually, some of them are joining us today from Turkey. Thank you so much for being here as well. So they have entered their 8th year, and they are still waiting without knowing, when they would be resettled and which country would accept them. So my research, part of my research looks at those transnational structures and global border politics that confine refugees in a so-called transit country like Turkey. And from that particular location of Turkey, I also theorized about a larger pattern, which is, how the states use waiting and uncertainty to prevent refugees from migrating to global north and keep them in liminal spaces across global south. And at the same time, I also bring the notion of everyday into this picture. And I think this is where feminist and queer perspectives are really helpful. So I look at refugees' everyday lives in Turkey, their communal relationships, their labor practices, their encounters with local townspeople, and their experiences of being a refugee and being a queer trans person in small conservative towns. And I particularly focus on this notion of waiting, as Jane mentioned, and try to understand how refugees cope with this very precarious and uncertain form of waiting, and what kinds of lives and what kinds of queer solidarities and queer socialities they establish as they wait in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you, Elif. Professor Hedzik?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, pleasure, and a bit scary too, given the kinds of things I'm going to talk about. So the reason I personally work on refuge, asylum, migration is because I cannot not do it. I'm a formerly displaced person and refugee from war, and this is not a kind of skin that I can just shed or leave behind. So displacement and global apartheid are always with me, even when I'm working on seemingly different and disconnected things. I was born and raised in Mostar, a town in what was then Yugoslavia, now Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when the war was about to start, which for us meant when the first explosions shook up our town, my family escaped. We thought then just for the weekend, but ultimately it took us 5 years to return for visit. And it's been 30 years this April. And it seems incredible that it's been that long. I've never lived since then in Mostar for more than a couple of months. Have never been able to pick grapes in late summer. Sorry. This loss is there. It's always there. Right now, in February, is the time when we have the first blossoms on almond trees and acacia trees. And if they're ever going to have snow until May, so it's a very different place. Anyhow, my family lived in Croatia, and then alongside really thousands of refugees from my hometown and elsewhere in Bosnia, mostly women and children. And then we lived in Germany, where we were refugees, but with an uncertain legal status. And similar, very, very similar to what Elif is talking about, this legal status put us in a state of waiting. It was a temporary stay of deportation. Each of these temporary stays of deportation and passports was valid only for half a year. And it was very clear that the state would begin deportations as soon as the war ended. And this insecure legal status is not at all unusual. And this is one of the reasons, and I'll talk about this more later, why I think about global apartheid rather than the border, because people can be inside a country of refuge but have an insecure legal status and live in this kind of state of protracted unsettlement, not really resettlement. So the legal structure of refugee incorporation in Germany provides secure refuge and asylum only to very select groups. And today, there are over 200,000 refugees who live in Germany, Afghan, Iraqi, Somali, and others, who are slated to be deported, who have this temporary state of deportation. Others have another insecure status called subsidiary protection that, among other things, prohibits family unification for a couple of years. And that creates all kinds of stressors because family breakdowns are something to reckon with for refugees. And so this is actually the main subject of this current project, Barely Tolerated, an ethnographic film about life in uncertain refuge and deferred deportation. I'm also writing about ethics and politics of asylum engagements based on the work that I've done as an expert witness. So ironically, I find myself on the other side. I've testified in the US and in the UK asylum cases for over a decade, based on my research and expertise about Ghanaian gender politics and gender configurations. And initially I was sought out by lawyers who were assisting Ghanaian women who were fleeing female genital cutting, domestic violence, and marital rape. And more recently, I've also served as an expert witness for people who have kind of these compacted and complex cases that face multiple systems of exclusion, such as queer asylum seekers who also have HIV/AIDS or kidney disease. So what this work reveals sharply for me, and the reason why it connects to feminist studies, is that it shows very clearly that liberal frameworks of women's and sexual protections are not just insufficient, but are a part of the problem. And I can talk more about that later. And finally, one of the reasons why the topics of displacement and refuge keep haunting me and keep coming back to me is because the country that I'm from, Bosnia, has also become kind of a buffer zone, to use the language from Catherine Bestman's Militarized Global Apartheid, and we'll post these links later on in the chat. A country that itself serves as a border and deters refugees from the global south from reaching the EU. And at the same time, there's a mass exodus of Bosnians from Bosnia who are going to Austria, Germany, and Switzerland to work as laborers, and some, I would say, refugee laborers. And there are many Bosnians, including my family members, who find themselves in renewed refuge in Germany. So after 3 decades, they're back for different reasons and under different conditions. And this is a background of another project that I'm working on. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Saida. All right, so now we'd like to ask each of our speakers to give their perspective on what are the kind of large themes characterizing migration and detention and asylum now. And after that kind of big picture, we'll hone in on what are the feminist and queer methodologies that they use to look at those bigger questions. So this one will start with Elif.
Yeah, I'd like to begin on kind of like it's a really big question, so I'll try to answer that question through my own research. In terms of queer and trans asylum, we have been witnessing a very big shift in the last few years. So until very recently, LGBTQ refugees were considered a particularly vulnerable group. So this is the official language that asylum authorities use. A particularly vulnerable group because of their non-normative genders and sexualities. And because of this assumed vulnerability, also made them a prioritized group among other refugee groups. And what I mean by prioritization is that international humanitarian organizations like UNHCR used to process LGBTQ asylum applications on a much faster track. And more importantly, the main resettlement countries like the United States and Canada used to reserve prioritized refugee quotas for LGBT applicants and used to expedite their resettlement processes. But since 2015, this context has changed drastically in line with global border politics, especially in the wake of the so-called refugee crisis, as well as I mentioned earlier, the rise of, conservative right-wing white supremacists and anti-migration, anti-refugee governments across the world. So for instance, in 2015, Canada has begun to implement new resettlement programs for refugees from Syria. So this was how the Canadian government has responded to the so-called refugee crisis. But at the same time, Canada has stopped accepting any newcomer LGBTQ refugees who used to go to Canada just within a year before 2015. So as you see, like how things abruptly change, and one group's mobility comes at the expense of another group's immobility because of those very limited refugee quotas and different vulnerability categories. And if you go to another context, another main resettlement country in terms of queer trans asylum cases has typically been the United States. But in 2017, with the Trump administration's executive order, as we all know, as the Muslim travel ban, the refugee resettlement from predominantly Muslim countries has been suspended indefinitely. And last year, the Biden administration lifted the ban, but I can say that refugee resettlement rates to US are still very low, and the process of resettlement has become much more securitized than ever. And finally, another important context I want to mention is the European Union. So during this very same time period, since 2015, EU has also brought a lot of structural changes to securitize its borders. And in 2016, EU and Turkey signed a deal. And accordingly, Turkey receives huge amounts of financial support, I believe close to 9 billion euros, and from EU. And in return, it promises to keep refugees within the boundaries of Turkey and kind of prevent them from migrating to Europe. So if we think about these three different contexts in the same picture, then we see a common pattern, which is, how these restrictive border politics, long waiting times, and shrinking resettlement options serve to keep refugees in liminal zones of waiting and confinement, like detention centers, transit countries like Turkey, or buffer zones like Bosnia, as Saida mentioned, and prevent them from migrating to global north. And this pattern becomes more visible if you look at the numbers. Today, only less than 2% of world's refugees are actually resettled in the global north, and 98% of them are living and waiting in global south. And I think another thing we can discuss, if we look at this shift, the shift from how LGBTQ refugees were once a vulnerable and prioritized group, and only within a matter of a few years, they have become completely abandoned by the international asylum authorities, asylum organizations, and the resettlement countries. So this shift shows us how the states border asylum and citizenship politics, and the kinds of notions of, who deserves to be resettled, whose asylum claim is prioritized, and who is excluded from migration and citizenship altogether, keep changing in line with the nation state's own political, economic, and security interests. And this shift also shows us that how today the states are able to make these decisions very abruptly and very arbitrarily without any justification or any political accountability.
Absolutely. And I think that the arbitrariness of the system and this categorization of what we deem and what our political systems deem as worthy or unworthy migrants really reflects this notion of allocating value to people across lines of gender and sexuality, and also as a means of controlling migrant populations. And going off of that point about this shift towards securitizing our borders and thus abandoning vulnerable populations, that has also in turn led to increased criminalization. Over the past decade, we've seen such an expansion and a growth of this thing called the immigration industrial complex in the United States, which essentially deals with how economic and political structures pertain to confinement and criminalization, and the policing of immigrant communities, and the production of these detention systems between sort of state and private and federal actors. And so kind of with that, the policing and detention of asylum seekers in the United States, especially queer asylum seekers, has served as a means of this control and of maintaining sort of a heteronormative US society, a construct that is essentially inextricable from these other forms of racial, economic, and colonial logics. And in that sense, denying the movement inherent in migration and containing asylees in these privately operated prisons, county jails, and federal detention centers really serves as this form of kind of rampant criminalization and dehumanization. And so in just a moment, you'll see sort of some headlines and some snippets from reports projected on the screen. I just have a visual aid that reflects kind of that notion of how people, asylum seekers in detention, have been criminalized and confined. So please have the visual aid. So we will be including links and resources at the end of this conversation. But over the past decade, essentially, the number of detained asylees in removal proceedings has skyrocketed, and advocates and scholars and activists have repeatedly highlighted and pointed towards how dehumanizing this system is, including survivors of the system. And so the snippets that you see up on this screen here are taken from reports and articles that detail firsthand accounts of medical neglect, discrimination, egregious living conditions, and physical and psychological abuse in US immigration detention facilities. And so we will now link the full reports and articles in the chat. And I urge you to take a look at them when you have some time later to understand the magnitude of this problem. And so while these abuses are widespread and systemic in immigrant detention, queer and trans people in these facilities are often at heightened risks of being denied medical care and facing violence. ICE has also often uses something called administrative solitary confinement to segregate trans and queer migrants in things called special housing units, which are essentially segregated facilities with limited access to medical care, outdoor spaces, socialization, and more, which all have a really detrimental effect on people's mental health. And these units are intended to protect people who are administratively segregated, but as we've seen through trends, solitary disproportionately impacts trans women of color and serves as another mechanism to contain and confine migrant bodies. And so many facilities are still able to operate in relative obscurity. ICE, CBP, and the Department of Health don't collect or report demographic data about sexual orientation or gender identity or sexual identity of detained asylum seekers, further invisibilizing these systemic experiences and really leaving it up to survivors and advocates to expose the injustices of detention within the United States.
Pramila, so much of what you're saying resonates with what's going on at the borders of the EU as well. So the criminalization that you're talking about now also extends to criminalization of solidarity itself. And so across the EU states, but also the countries around the EU, in the last decade, a number of laws have been passed that criminalize those who are assisting refugees and people on the move. And I've been thinking that that is actually quite resonant with the Fugitive Slave Act that had been passed here a century and a half ago, or 170 years ago. I have this idea that we need to put them side by side and look at exactly how they talk to each other, how they track. And another sort of parallel is this question of death and neglect. And I would say that I'm not sure it's a new trend, but it's a newly made visible trend, is death by design, whereby the militarized borders and the prevention of safe passages through the various countries into the EU have made refugee death not actually incidental, but a part of the plan. They're counted on as a method of deterrence. And so in the last 3 decades, or more precisely since 1993, which is when the EU first opened its internal borders, right, having the world celebrate that, but closed the external borders, 40,000 people have died trying to make it to the EU. And these deaths are not at all incidental. Another trend that I think that is global, that we see beyond the US, is the foreclosure of asylum. So we see around the global north declining number of asylum applications because people are prevented from lodging them, and declining rates of asylum approvals. And I would say that people are not talking about it as such so much, but I think that there's actually something like a tacit agreement among the countries from the global north that it's okay to violate international law, that it's okay to basically suspend the protections afforded by it. And so that becomes really visible in these moments in say, authoritarian states, or when we have right-wing governments, but it's an ongoing process. And we see that today with Biden's failure or decision to stop the Remain in Mexico policy. In addition to some of the new trends, I also think we see recurring trends. And one of the recurring trends is that we don't pay enough attention to is the connection between wars and the fact that people become refugees from wars. For those of us living in the US, I think it's particularly important to remember that more than half of displaced refugees in the world today have been displaced by US wars and occupations. That's 40 million people. So right now, the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and we may be on the brink of just another war. And so we can't condone wars at the same time as we profess to care about refugees. And when we look at history, and this is sort of where feminist theorizing and historical analysis comes in, we see some of these enduring forces, which is that what's happening in Afghanistan today is quite similar to what happened after the US withdrawal from Vietnam, but on a much smaller scale, in the sense that fewer refugees are being resettled. And what's recurring here is this myth of benevolent humanitarianism. Oh, hey, we're going to accept people. Refugees become these sanitizing figures that kind of brush away the violence of war and occupation and make us look away from structural causes and engage in these feel-good fixes. Finally, I would say that one enduring but really kind of newly visible structure to many people, and that has to do with some of the scholarship that's been published on the topic, is that we see that we're not just dealing with closed borders, but with partially closed borders and porous borders, and with the structure of global apartheid. Global apartheid is more than a metaphor. It's a concept that describes a world that's both forcibly divided but also regulated by a very large governmental apparatus. This connects to Pramila, to what you were saying about a racialized calculus of who gets to have rights. And global apartheid defines who gets to have rights as people travel, move, work, or simply live. So Catherine Westerman, who's just published a book called Militarized Global Apartheid, defines it as a loosely integrated effort by the countries of the global north to protect themselves against the mobility of people from the global south. But more than just protection, global apartheid is actually a mechanism for regulation of mobility and immobility. So it's not so much that the global north protects itself, because the global north always also invites people in. Economies of the global north are dependent on the precarious labor of dispossessed labor migrants and refugees. Our food systems, childcare, healthcare are dependent on skilled and so-called low-skilled labor, on brain drain, what we might call care drain of health workers in the global south and global east. And so we see entire countries that are at the brink of having their public health systems at the brink of collapse. Because of the brain drain of healthcare workers. And I've seen that firsthand, both in Ghana, where I did my research, and in Bosnia. And so if we break economies, steal land, steal people, we dispossess people in places and countries and produce additional refugees also. And then we have sort of the humanitarian fix, which is that like individual doctors and nurses from rich countries take vacations to volunteer in the global south, right? But that can barely make a dent in this very systematic problem. And so this is a very kind of enduring structure. And finally, I would say that another enduring structure that connects to what's happening with migration is the structure of white supremacy that shapes who gets to have rights of citizens, who gets to have employment rights, who gets to have voting rights, who gets to have a right to life. Those are imperiled for citizens, and citizenship itself is imperiled. So we saw that kind of most clearly with Trump's so-called second look policy that tried to take away citizenship from naturalized immigrants. But we also see it today with respect to restrictions to voting rights. And so I would say that we need to pay attention to how these things connect.
Thank you, Saida. We actually have a couple of questions in the chat that we were going to wait and answer questions at the end, but it seems appropriate to address them now, and we really appreciate people's participation. So we actually have two questions dealing with privatization. And the first one from Caroline says, is there any way that we can, I've lost the question, bring more transparency to what are these, privatization of detention? And I know Alif was going to talk about private refugee sponsorship. So it's clearly disturbing, to realize that so many of these structures and apparatuses are privatized so that people just don't know about them. And so a closely related question from Sylvia is that she says, I'm curious about how families of detained immigrants navigate the carceral system. Because of the insidious privatized nature of detention, the process of finding a missing relative can be hellacious. So yeah, those are both really good questions. And I know Pramila's thought a lot about privatization and detention. So, and that Alif also has something to say. So we'll do this quickly, then we'll go on to what's particular about the feminist approaches to this scholarship.
Yeah, I think, those are both incredible questions. And I think really what this brings attention to is the importance of advocates and organizers being on the ground and being directly connected to people who are inside these facilities. Like I mentioned, and like Caroline touches upon, these privatized facilities, they don't report information publicly. It's really hard to access sort of demographic data or anything along those lines. And so in that sense, it's really up to sort of the people inside, really, in terms of self-advocacy, and as well as advocates outside who, for example, file civil rights and civil liberties complaints on behalf of people who are detained, who file class action lawsuits, which you'll be able to see in some of the links that will, and some of the resources that we'll link at the end of this conversation. But essentially, it makes it really, really important for advocates to have that connection, because those are really the only people who can bring attention to these conditions, because sort of facilities that are sort of under more federal jurisdiction, there is like a level of kind of federal monitoring and of like inspections and like ombudsman inspections, all of that. But in terms of private facilities, it's really up to the representatives and sometimes the family members and the advocates of the people who are inside. And as to the second question about the family members of people who are inside, I can't speak to sort of that experience myself, but I do work on a hotline I work on a national hotline that essentially provides support to both people inside the system and the family members of people who are inside the system. And so when I receive a call from the family member, from a family member of a detained individual, or of someone who maybe has recently migrated here and who they lost contact with, those are usually the most difficult conversations, because there's just so much obscurity and so much there are just so many challenges in tracking people down and in locating people. ICE does have a national database, a detainee locator, but to use that, there are a lot of specifics. There are language barriers. People who are in detention are assigned these arbitrary numbers called A numbers, which are sort of these digits that essentially just contribute and perpetuate this dehumanization of people inside the system. And it really makes it difficult for family members to access people inside, and even calls like themselves are like really inaccessible, because they cost commissary funds and all of that. And so really like the issue is that it's hard for families of detained immigrants to maintain connections with people inside. And that's exactly one of the reasons why this system is just so dehumanizing and so egregious because of that.
I think there's so much to talk about, but we really do want to get to how each of you as scholars and activists, what's particular to your very important research, what do you draw particularly from a feminist perspective, and just kind of, as we talked about earlier this week, what does it mean to be an engaged feminist scholar at this point in time, given what's going on? Let's see, Alif?
Sure. Well, these are really big questions, because I feel like, feminist and queer perspectives have really informed my entire scholarship, like including my thinking, my analysis, my writing style, my teaching, my pedagogies, my research methodologies, as well as the ways in which I engage with my interlocutors, both during and after research. But I'll try to narrow down my answer. So to me, being an engaged feminist scholar, first and foremost, it means to recognize people's agency. And this is not something we often see in migration and asylum studies. So in my research and academic publications and presentations, in classes I teach, I always try to challenge such dominant portrayals of refugees as passive victimized subjects. And this figure of victimized refugee, we see it everywhere, especially today in this context in which the borders are closed and refugees and migrants are detained and confined in limit waiting and incarceration, and they are enduring. And of course, it's very important to explore and make visible and challenge those problems and difficulties. But for me, it's also equally important to make visible, to understand, to explore how refugees and migrants negotiate and resist against those constraints. So I find it very important to write and teach about refugees' communal and political organizing, their art and activism, as well as the small mundane and intimate ways in which they establish solidarity networks, they support each other, and kind of like, they find creative ways to transform their lives, to transform their surrounding environments, and to assert their agencies. So I would like to illustrate these points. I would like to show a few pictures from my field site. Chris, can you please put the slides up and start with the first photo? So I hope you see it now because I can't. But that first photo is from a political demonstration that LGBTQ refugees organized in 2018 to protest long waiting times, especially after the Trump administration's Muslim travel ban. And if you look at the signs, although some of them use a kind of self-victimizing language like Save Iranian Refugees, I still want to emphasize that when this protest took place, Turkey was under an official state of emergency and the government had banned all political protests. So refugees organized these demonstrations by both resisting the state and by risking deportation. So I cannot emphasize how important this is. And if we can go to the next picture. So this one is from a communal picnic that refugees organized together with activists from Pink Life, which is an association in Turkey founded by trans women and sex workers. And when this photo was taken, the Turkish government, again in 2018, the Turkish government had also issued an LGBTQ ban that restricted all LGBTQ gatherings, and not just political protests, also social events, parties, and any kind of social cultural events. So the kind of joy and collectivity in this picture just reminds me, how refugees create those moments of collectivity, joy and togetherness, even under most restrictive environments. And if we can go to the next slide. So you will see two photos, and these are from different workshops that refugees organized with activists from another organization, Chaos GL. And again, these photos show us, how refugees establish trans-local alliances and they create a togetherness that transgresses nation-state borders. So these are some examples of, how we can see agency not only in overt political organizing, but also in small and seemingly unimportant moments of everyday life, like a picnic or a storytelling workshop. And this attention to everyday life, to small and ordinary moments, and to kind of affective structures of joy, pleasure, friendship, and intimacy is what feminist and queer perspectives, I guess, have brought to my understanding of the world. And I just want to kind of wrap up my reflection on this question by saying that as a feminist scholar, I see my job as not only to kind of show and explore those moments of collectivity as academic matters, but as Jane said in the very beginning, I also see it as my responsibility to kind of to actively engage in such communal and political organizing and support the emergence of such places and encounters that bring refugees together with other groups like students, artists, and activists. And I think these kinds of collaborations and connections and conversations are the sites where we can articulate a collective vision to dismantle interrelated systems of oppression.
Aida or Pramila, do you want to elaborate on your feminist and queer approaches?
I'm happy to go, but Pramila, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I think something that really resonates with me from that discussion, at least, is kind of this potential for solidarity and for community between the people who have been most affected by these structures, and to understand sort of the agency that that people within these structures have. Like detention might be detention is such a confining and oppressive system and such an oppressive structure. But like when it comes down to it, the people who are both inside and exiting the system have this incredible capacity for self-advocacy and for agency. And so as kind of we've seen over the past 2 years, especially through the pandemic, a lot of people who are inside facilities. I think the number is literally thousands at this point. I know there was about 2,000 people who in 2020 alone did this, but a lot of people who are inside facilities have gone on hunger strikes, essentially to bring attention to COVID conditions in detention. And many others, like I mentioned before, to respond to Caroline's question about privatization, have shared their testimonies with lawyers and advocates filing lawsuits and civil rights and civil liberties complaints against ICE. None of this would be possible without the efforts of people inside. And I've also known a number of individuals who have been released from detention who return to and contribute to community organizations to support people who are inside. And that's why kind of these movements being centered and being led by the people who have been most affected, by the communities who have been most affected, including family members, is so incredibly important. And I think that really gets to the heart and the core of what a feminist approach is in terms of recognizing people's common vulnerabilities and our common humanity, and learning from the people who are most impacted, and knowing how to listen versus rather than imposing sort of our sense of what needs to be done. As people who are outside of these facilities, as people who aren't inside. And I think something that kind of really reflects that in action is how when you're visiting someone in detention, you are separated from them by this glass wall, essentially. You're not able to have sort of any person-to-person contact, and you're only able to communicate with them through a phone that's really grainy and that breaks up a lot of the time. And so and then since in-person visitation has ended, we've had to find other ways of maintaining these connections, and usually that's through the phone. And so kind of given these limitations to contact, it makes it all the more important to kind of take that step back and to listen rather than impose our senses as advocates of what needs to be done in order to make these conditions less hidden and make them less concealed, and create this space that is really sort of led and initiated by people who have been most impacted.
So much of what both Pramila and you were saying resonates with what I was going to talk about as well. As I was thinking about this question, so what is specifically feminist about this, and how do feminist and queer perspectives inform my work, and what does it mean to be an engaged feminist scholar? I too was thinking about this kind of discrepancy between the critiques that are necessary on the one hand, and then kind of the world building work, both in writing and research, but also through various kinds of practices that feminists also engage in. And for me, feminist methodology is actually what enables us to engage in both of these, because it links or articulates the relationship between the personal and the political, the intimate and the structural. And that kind of oscillation between the two, or kind of being able to move from the one to the other, is for me both rooted in feminist methodology, but also where I find inspiration and also encouragement. And second, because the work that I'm doing also involves me as a subject, and the community and communities I'm connected to as subjects, feminist methodology really is a source of kind of legitimacy and encouragement. And because no matter what, I feel kind of like I'm trespassing in so many other contexts if I do that kind of work. But for feminism, knowledge is not just discovery, so not just something that's out there you need to look out for, but it's also recovery. And so to recover communal experiences of refuge, asylum, deportation, to recover communal stories and memories and counter discourses, and that can include, in my approach, I'm open-ended, and that can include both moments of joy, but also some serious critique. That is something that feminism for me enables me to do, these kinds of layerings. And also, the feminist emphasis on collectivity and solidarity is really helpful, because when I do this work alone, it feels like something that is always a bit too dangerous. But when I do it with others, I feel like that we're creating something together, and that's kind of a beautiful feeling. Very long time ago, for my master's research, I wrote about migration-related topic. I wrote about naturalization and citizenship in Germany. And I learned really quickly that writing about something that's so close to home in an academic setting, that kind of this truth of the lives of the people I was connected to is not something that really should be subjected to peer reviews, that was not the project could not grow in that context. And the reason why I can write about these kind of more personal things now is because I have tenure, or rather that I feel like I can do it, is because I don't feel like I have to pass the muster. And these stories that want to be told and that seep out of me, they blur genres and they don't fit easily in academic categories. And that's something that feminism enables as well. And then the part of my work that's about more than research is about building community, bringing together scholars, writers, organizers, and artists. In my case, people who are formerly displaced, currently displaced, and refugees, and that connects to my teaching and pedagogy as well. So I can talk about those later on.
Thank you so much, Saida. I think we'll go to, and I would just encourage people to start asking questions now. We're approaching 5:30, and we'll just integrate these questions into the discussion. And so we did have one question from Gabby. What do you think documentaries, film, media get wrong about the LGBTQIA asylum seekers? Or what would you like to see more of in documentary film about LGBTQIA asylum seekers? And Alif, I think this is probably in your area of expertise. Do you want
I would love to speak to that question. That is something that I've been thinking a lot about in my research and in my own engagement with my refugee friends. So especially when I was in Turkey doing field work during 2017, 18, and 19, there were a lot of filmmakers, documentary makers, journalists, photographers from all over the world, like Canada, US, all European countries would just like visit Turkey to make films and news articles about refugees. And as much as these are kind of like, these have some positive impacts on refugees too, in terms of like increasing their visibility vis-a-vis these like asylum authorities and resettlement countries, which refugees otherwise do not have so much access to. But at the same time, they also reproduce a lot of stereotypes about refugees. I'll try to mention a few of them. I guess for me, the most problematic is kind of in line with what I said earlier about, you know, like recognizing agency is not something that we often see in, you know, representations of migrations and asylum. This also happens in media. So most of the time, refugees are portrayed as, you know, like victim figures. And they are also portrayed as like victimized by a very particular understanding of violence that is explained strictly through cultural and religious terms. So for instance, in terms of Iranian asylum seekers, they are often portrayed as victims of Islam, of Sharia law and their families. If you notice, almost with no exception, all documentaries about Iranian asylum seekers start with a law, like a big image of a mosque. And when Saida mentioned that how in most asylum analysis, US wars in Global South and militarization of Global South is not really taken into account in understanding why people migrate in the first place. In those documentaries, no one talks about the US sanctions on Iran, which actually make life for trans and queer folks very, very difficult. So for instance, we have this like victimized figure, and it's not just victimization, it's also the way in which those documentaries and films and media represent violence in a very culturalized understanding. They explain it with Iran's or Islam's culture and religious laws, and they really don't touch upon any structural problems that motivate people to migrate. And another problem I've noticed is kind of the ethics of, like consent and representing people. And these are also very, I think, strictly feminist issues that we can, or issues that we can discuss from feminist and queer perspectives. So most of the time, asylum seekers are portrayed in these films, but they are not asked for like consent form, and they are not given accurate, transparent information about the content and the possible impact of those films. So for instance, when I was in the field, again in 2000, I believe 19, two documentary makers from CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company, came to visit my field site. And we were told that they want to make a film about Iranian refugees' stuckness in Turkey to put some pressure on the Canadian government to open the borders. And we all agreed. I was also in the film. And then we were not given any further information. And months later, the film came out, and we realized that the film was actually about a serial killer who in Toronto, who particularly targets gay men from communities of color. And some of my interlocutors and refugee friends were portrayed as the possible victims. If they ever move from Turkey to Canada, they would be potential targets of that serial killer. So can you see the kind of like all these layers of problems like building upon each other, no consent, no information, victimization, wrong representation. So I can kind of like go on like this forever, but yeah, these are some of the main problems that we really need to think about when we think about the kind of visual representations of refugees.
Yeah, I think we could say the same thing. That it's always striking to me that when people talk about refugee movements or the movements of people from Central America, how rarely we see any discussion of the history of US involvement and intervention in Central America, particularly the wars that the US funded in El Salvador and Guatemala in the 70s and 80s. It's just still so striking to me how little attention is given to that, and in discussion of the current reasons people migrate, which are obviously still tied to US intervention. Well, we've talked quite a bit about activist movements, but we did want to let each of you specifically address kind of the movement, not from the academy to the activist movements. And I think this has already been clear in all of your work that you are looking to activists and refugee movements. In fact, all of you in some ways started there. Not, you didn't start this work in the academy, but you started in your everyday lives. But maybe you could each talk a little bit about our question, what can feminist and sexuality studies learn from contemporary refugee movements? And how can we better join forces with them? And I just would like to still encourage the audience to keep posting questions, and we'll work them in the last 25 minutes we have here. Saida, you look like you're ready to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I also wanted to follow up briefly on this question of the documentary, and the term that came to my mind is the control over a means of representation, right? So what we see here is like this very unequal relationship in which the Canadian Broadcasting Company is the one making the documentary, but also has such complete control over it. It's really not a collaboration on anything like equal terms, right? And so a segue for me into this question about movements is that I've been really inspired by various refugee-run organizations because they combine very astute political critique with the feminist politics of care and also queer politics of care. And that's something that I've found missing, and that it's often bifurcated with other kinds of organizations, but also other kinds of scholarship that kind of does the one or the other. And for instance, this past semester, we hosted an organization from London called Migrants Organize. And they, on the one hand, provide services, but on the other hand, they're very, very active in critiquing UK's asylum and refugee policies, but also changing it and transforming it and making refugees, asylum seekers, migrants into active political players. And they've been really successful at that. And so, and something else that I've learned from watching and following Bosnian activists is that for them, solidarity is very separate from humanitarianism. They make a very clear case that the kind of humanitarian helping that is dominant in the global north is very different from solidarity, which is outside of structures of capitalism and humanitarianism. And to me, they're an inspiration because they too bring together a kind of astute political awareness and care in the same framework.
I can follow up on that. So I think in addition to all those things that Saida mentioned, I think another really important thing that I personally learned from refugee movements and refugee epistemologies, and I think feminist gender and sexuality studies can also learn from refugee movements is a no border lens. So what I mean by a no border lens is kind of in my understanding, it's a collective vision that thinks about borders not only as geographical borders of the nation states or physical borders of the sites of incarceration like camps and prisons, but all kinds of invisible borders, like non-tangible, metaphorical or discursive borders that we keep facing in our everyday lives. And when we see borders in this expansive way, I think we realize that most of the bordering practices that refugees and other marginalized and dispossessed communities face share very common roots. So, for instance, indigenous movements for land, citizenship, and recognition, or women's fight for gender discrimination and glass ceiling in the workplace. I mean, even the metaphorical name glass ceiling, it comes from that bordering practice, right? Queer and trans people's fight for ungendered bedrooms, again, another spatial segregation, or unhoused people's fight for secure housing. These all might kind of seem like different and separate social justice issues, but I think a no border vision allows us to realize that, how they are all caused by bordering practices that separate people, separate us from each other based on some assumed differences and determine our differential access to land, citizenship, mobility, recognition based on those differences. So I personally learned this no border vision from refugee movements and grassroots organizing, like no border, no one is illegal movements. And I think movements like that gives us, and also what Saida mentioned, like what she learned from Bosnian activists, like movements like localized and more global movements give us very concrete tools to work with in kind of challenging and dismantling. Again, I feel like I keep finishing all of my answers with this, but I think they give us really concrete tools to dismantle different but interrelated systems of oppression. So border imperialism, colonialism, classism, ableism, cis heteropatriarchy. I see all of them as connected and also connected, and kind of a no border vision really helps me as a queer feminist scholar to see those connections and also try to challenge them.
Alif, maybe it would just make sense for you to continue with answering this question from Taku in the chat. What is an effective strategy for advocating for LGBTQ asylum seekers in a state like Japan, where he's currently conducting fieldwork, that doesn't offer any realistic pathway for legal residency, work permit, or third country resettlement?
Sure. Well, I don't know too much about Japan, but I remember looking at the kind of global statistics for refugee resettlement a few years ago, after the Trump Muslim travel ban, the Trump administration's travel ban. I just have this like vague memory of Japan accepting only 28 refugees, giving them permanent legal status in 1 year. So that was like incredibly low rates. And from that, I kind of understood that there is no realistic pathway for legal residency. I honestly don't have a kind of concrete answer to that question. I think it might be a good idea to talk to refugees, refugee solidarity movements, and try to articulate some kinds of strategies that might work within the context of Japan, which I'm not really familiar with.
Yeah, and perhaps also to connect with other kinds of movements in Japan that challenge Japan's racial hierarchies that I imagine are part of this foreclosure of asylum as well. So there are domestic workers in Japan from all parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia. There are people who lived in Japan for generations but are not technically considered Japanese. And so when we think about challenging kind of the racial calculus of who belongs and who doesn't, then, you know, expanding that and challenging that, and, you know, thinking about challenging Japan's militarization, also like that might expand these frameworks.
Yeah, so I think I can make a bridge between what you just said, Said, and another question. I mean, a lot of you tonight have talked about categories of belonging and exclusion and how often these kinds of discussions around refugee status and citizenship do come, unfortunately, back to that question of the deserving and the undeserving refugee. And so we have a question in the chat from Madeline saying that many immigration stories seem to emphasize women in the context of children. And I think that's really true. Some of my work is focused on children crossing the border, either with families or unaccompanied minors. And it's true that a lot of media attention is given, sympathetic media attention is given to families and women with children crossing the borders. And I think we would all agree that is a very difficult situation, but does that then contribute to, you know, deserving and undeserving categories? So Madeline asks, what is the split of refugees between women with children and women without? And I'm kind of elaborating on your question, Madeline, to have us think again about Alif's point, like how do we accord agency to women with children without painting them as somehow victims because they seem more vulnerable?
I want to also follow up on that very quickly. So for me, in my research, it's kind of a little bit different. It's the opposite. So we mostly see lesbian, bisexual, non-binary, trans women applicants as single or partner, but without children. And some of the lesbian applicants have children, and this actually creates a problem when they apply for asylum. So it kind of decreases their chances of being granted asylum and recognition. And this comes from a very heterosexist understanding of queerness, right? So the dominant conception of being a lesbian or being a queer woman is that they are unmarried, they are young, they are without their families, they don't marry to opposite sex. And some of the women's lived experiences challenge that kind of innate understanding of queerness. Like, I was born this way and I haven't changed since then. So sometimes people's self-identifications and their desires change. And sometimes people marry to a man for opposite sex for safety reasons. Because for instance, I'm thinking about a few of my interlocutors who did this kind of like strategic marriages with men in Iran to kind of hide their lesbian sexual orientation. But when it comes to the asylum interviews, it's really hard to justify those strategic moves, and their previous heterosexual marriages or having a child decreases their chances for being seen as an authentic lesbian refugee.
Yeah, and I would contextualize the answer to the question also by saying that when we think about refugees, it's true that we see women with children, but when we think about asylum seekers, there are actually a lot of cases of single women, whether those women have never been married, or whether they left because they experience violence within the marriage or within the family. These are not, no matter what, these are not empowering frameworks. Like we're dealing in both sets of cases with very victimizing sets of representations. And I would highly recommend a text by my friend and colleague Abolitionist George called Getting the Hang of It, that talks about the kinds of violations that women have to exaggerate in order to be seen as deserving. And so even though women are, the majority of the world's refugees, the gendered structure of deservedness is such that is actually quite demeaning.
Yeah, I think going off of that, we've seen kind of like those binary frameworks of like the deserving, like meritorious, refugee, and like migrant, kind of in discussions about like the US border and about family separation, and how so much kind of outrage and like public attention and media attention was placed on family separation in the past couple of years with the Trump administration's zero tolerance kind of border policies. And but with that also, of course, like came like a slew of policies that like affected like all migrants. And currently, like the majority of people in the U.S. detention system are men, and we see people who and the people who are kind of most affected and like most kind of implicated in that system are often single. And so I think kind of like going off of that, it's really important to kind of just reframe the way that we even that we consider like these frameworks, that we consider like these categories, and move away from them and move towards this acknowledgement of kind of the vulnerabilities that are inherent to everyone entering the system and exiting it, rather than people who like maybe like rather than kind of the sympathy that is like usually afforded to like people who like are part of the nuclear family in some sense, like through our through kind of like our constructs. And so yeah.
I just realized as I was speaking that I didn't specify what kinds of asylum seekers I was talking about. So I was speaking specifically about West African asylum seekers and the women that whom I worked with. I think that for people from Central America, what we see at least is that a lot of them come with families. And so I don't think that that's the case for everybody, but this kind of women conjoined with child figure is much more prominent in the representations of Central American asylum seekers.
We only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to again encourage the audience to ask questions, and it can be anything. I know we've covered an awful lot of ground tonight, but feel free to ask anything very specific, factual, or more conceptual. But in the meantime, while we're seeing if anybody has more questions, do we want to be a little bit more specific about this question of how we can join forces with abolitionist movements? I know we've all talked about the resources we want to put in the chat, and maybe it would be useful to people if we can provide a little context about some of those resources. Pramila, do you want to talk a little bit more, if there are students watching, about the Kata group and the incredible work that you've done on campus, setting up connections between students and refugees and people in detention?
Yeah, I think something that I really want like everyone to take away from this conversation is how like feasible and possible and important it is to get involved in these movements. It doesn't matter how young you are, or if you have a background in this work or in this scholarship. Anyone really can get involved, and it's definitely like a very critical time for that, at least kind of in the landscape of like immigration policy, specifically pertaining to kind of like regional like detention centers. For example, like this past fall, so many detention centers in New Jersey shut down because of the advocacy efforts of grassroots organizers and of people inside and of hunger strikers. And we've also seen similar efforts in places like California and Illinois lead to moratoriums on private detention and sort of like progress and headway and policies in other areas as well. And of course, a lot of the organizations that are really kind of contributing to the bulk of the energy and the momentum behind these movements are like abolition focused organizations, understanding that understanding that these organizations are working towards policy changes while maintaining this larger goal of ending detention in its entirety, making sure that sort of all these incremental changes do not interfere or conflict with that larger like structural sort of systemic like transformation that Alif was pointing towards about kind of a world without borders, and of course like a world without prisons and detention as well. And so like it is so possible to be a part of these movements, to join forces with people inside and people like on the ground and organizing. These campaigns are really constantly looking for organizers and volunteers. I currently work on the Freedom for Immigrants National Hotline, which is the largest detention hotline in the US that connects volunteers to people who are inside and their family members, like I was mentioning before. That's an incredible organization. Another organization that really sort of specifically deals with a lot of the topics that we've been discussing today is the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, an organization that is dedicated to supporting and advocating for LGBTQIA individuals who are inside and exiting the detention system, as well as their communities. And also, it's important to sort of also like look towards our campus, and we don't even have to look past Cornell itself to get involved in these movements. Of course, the Cornell Anti-Detention Alliance is engaged with a lot of these sort of local, statewide, regional, and national organizations. And of course, like the links and the resources placed in the chat will direct you towards our website and the FGCS programs page for the organization. And also, there are other student power groups on campus here that are invested in this abolitionist work, like the Build Bridges Not Borders Coalition, which is a group of student organizations mobilizing to transform institutional structures within our school community. And so, yeah, I really strongly urge everyone, especially students, to take a look at the resources in the chat, and that will be sent out after this conversation, just to get involved on whatever level you can.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in very quickly?
Oh, sure. And then we have a question that Saeed is going to take. Go ahead, Ali.
Okay. No, kind of instead of answering this question, I actually want to use this as an opportunity to ask support from our audience. Just kind of like thinking about how we can like bring different forces together. So the Turkish state is trying to deport 3 refugees. The case was finalized yesterday. And now we are like urgently looking for journalists, filmmakers, like the people who have access to big media outlets to bring some more visibility to this case and put some pressure on the Turkish state to stop the deportations. So I think our email addresses are visible to the audience. So if you are interested, if you know anyone who will be interested, please email me and I will be happy to put you in touch with those refugees. Sorry, Saida.
No, yeah, that's thanks so much, Elif. I love that you're doing something concrete. I think Jane, you were muted. Did you want to say something?
to read the question for you, but do you want to read it from Amelia?
Yeah, sure. We have a question that says, I'd be curious for your thoughts on how some gender-based work furthers carceral systems, such as by criminalizing the person who harm migrant women, etc. I used to work for a DV immigration services provider and often felt this tension inherent to the system. So I absolutely agree with you. And I think I can speak for all of us that we are all on board against what people call carceral feminism. And this is what I was trying to refer to earlier about the limitations of liberal feminism that focuses on rights and violation of rights very narrowly without looking at the broader social context in which these violations are happening, including, racism, overall criminalization, and what happens to people when they don't have secure papers. And so there's both a social justice movement against carceral feminism and there's feminist theorizing against carceral feminism. And I feel like abolition is actually a wonderful framework, both theoretically and politically, to show just how problematic it is. It's quite difficult for people to wrap their minds around this because we've been trained for decades now in this kind of liberal thought that focuses on women's rights and violations in these very narrow terms. I found that teaching that people can agree with abolition, but then do precisely this kind of work, Amelia, that you're talking about. And so I feel like our job, actually, as one of my jobs as professors, is to keep shedding light on the limitations of liberal feminism and carceral feminism, and to take that both within and outside the academy. So, yeah, thanks.
Camila or Leith, do you want to add anything, or does anybody have a last word about concrete steps we can take to act on this issue, to work toward abolition?
I just want to say, one thing that is that I have actually kind of learned only when I moved to Canada, which is also the importance of bringing feminist queer movements, migrant movements, abolitionist movements together with indigenous movements. And it's really a shame that, so this is kind of self-reflection, but also for all of us, I studied for Cornell, which is built on stolen land and violences of settler colonialism. I was there physically for 7 years, but I really didn't learn almost like kind of nothing about indigenous histories, the histories of settler colonialism. And in a sense, only when I moved here and engaged with indigenous movements, I try to see all those connections, like how migration is an indigenous issue, because this whole no border vision makes so much sense when we look at, like indigenous epistemologies and indigenous ways of engaging with the world. So I feel like whatever we do in our own context, we should also keep those connections in mind as well.
Thank you, Elise. That's a really important reminder for all of us here and many places, right? Well, thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank Chris and Nick with eCornell. I want to thank the audience members for coming and for your active attention. And I really want to thank Elif and Pramila and Saida, who are all very busy people, and we spent a lot of time thinking through these issues, and I think you all conveyed just how really critical, and I appreciate how passionate and informed at the same time you all are. So thank you, everybody. Be safe, and please feel free to reach out to me at FGSS if you have any questions about any of this. Thanks again, everybody, and good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.